Persons who follow me in the social media space, especially on Twitter, and have been paying attention to the recommendations I've been making for the last several years for the diversification of the Jamaican economy and for us to become more resilient, you will be familiar with some of what I'm about to share. Now, with the US imposing a 10% tariff on imports from Jamaica, there are specific implications for the Jamaican economy. Persons who have bought my book, The Public Debt Nexus, a case study of Jamaica, you will be familiar with some of this because it has been covered in chapters 4 and chapter 6. So you know the linkages between the trade balance, the balance of payment, the impact on the NIR, and the public debt. So I'm just going to give you a synopsis right now. You can go and read the book for a better understanding of how these are intertwined. The book covers governance and public debt management, as well as many other areas of the economy, estimates of expenditure, etc., from the 1960s to 2012. And it contains information up to 2020 because the book was published after 2020. Now, here we go. Let's look at the basics. If the US imposes a 10% tariff on goods imported from Jamaica, it means that Jamaica's exports will face higher costs when selling to US companies. What does that mean for us? What does that mean for the economy? What does that mean for NIR? This makes Jamaica's goods less competitive compared to other suppliers. Jamaica already has a skewed trade balance. We are an open, import-dependent economy. We are importing far more than we export. The tables are also in my book. The graphs are also in my book, so you can see the changes and the differences there. A new tariff could reduce exports to the US, widening the trade deficit as businesses, manufacturers, hoteliers, and the government continue to rely heavily on imported goods. You would also recall that our Minister of Finance made a statement in Parliament recently pertaining to the removal of GCT on raw food items. Now, this is going to push us even farther back in relation to the trade deficit if the US proceeds to impose those tariffs. And we're not here to criticize the US. The US is at liberty to do what they need to do. We have to talk about the management of the Jamaican economy and how we are going to protect the hard-won gains that we have made over the last 13 years or so. Now let's look a little bit at Jamaica's import dependence. Jamaica is an open, vulnerable, and highly import-dependent economy. The cars, the machinery, the equipment, even raw material for our manufacturers, the hoteliers, a significant portion of the goods and services in our hotels are imported. We rely on imports for raw materials, machinery, food, consumer goods, etc. If our exports to the US decline due to tariffs, our ability to offset these imports with foreign exchange earnings will weaken. This will have a direct impact on the balance of payments. I'm not going to take it for granted that everybody understands what this is, so let me define it for you. The balance of payments is really a record of all financial transactions between Jamaica and the rest of the world. If exports fall while imports remain high, then Jamaica's BOP deteriorates, meaning more money is leaving the country than what is coming in. So naturally now you have to start thinking about the net international reserves, the NIR. There's a risk there. If the trade deficit worsens and foreign exchange inflows slow down, pressure will mount on Jamaica's net international reserves. This is a cushion of foreign currency that helps to stabilize the economy. This can lead to a borrowing spiral. We saw that happening in the 1970s, 1980s. With declining exports, a widening trade deficit, and pressure on the NIR, Jamaica will need to borrow more to cover shortfalls. This could mean returning to capital markets for expensive loans to keep the economy afloat, because if we begin borrowing heavily again and if we have significant trade deficits, then our credit rating is going to be impacted. Let's talk about that. So if Jamaica's external position weakens, credit rating agencies like S&P, Standard & Poor's, right? Fitch, Moody's could downgrade the country's rating. We pray to God that it doesn't happen, but it's a possibility. We have to foresight. A downgrade makes borrowing more expensive, reducing investor confidence and slowing economic growth. We have come a long way. We have come a long way. A 10% tariff by the US on Jamaica's imports could have serious, deleterious ripple effects affecting trade, foreign exchange reserves, and the public debt. To mitigate these risks, Jamaica must focus on diversifying exports. How long have I been singing this song? Who has been paying attention? We must focus on reducing import dependence and strengthening local industries. We have to make more foreign exchange. Share your thoughts with me. I'm going to give you the antecedent in a minute. Now that I've given you a quick overview, let me just take you back to where we're coming from. This is really a cautionary analysis, looking at how a balance of payment crisis in 2025 could undermine Jamaica's debt reduction gains. Jamaica has made commendable progress in reducing its public debt to GDP ratio. And we have to really big up Dr. Peter Phillips, who started it. Mention also the Honorable Mr. Shaw and, of course, Dr. Clark, Dr. Nigel Clark. They lifted a very, very heavy burden to take us to where we are at. And we cannot ignore the role of the Prime Minister as a leader. Jamaica has made commendable progress. We have achieved macroeconomic stability after decades of fiscal mismanagement, trade imbalances, and external shocks. But a balance of payment crisis in 2025 could erase these hard-won gains, pushing the country back into unsustainable debt accumulation and renewed dependence on external financing. Can we learn a lesson from history? What have we learned? What preparation did we put in place? Was there any foresighting to look ahead to see where we want to be in 2030 and to put the necessary steps in place to diversify the economy so we don't find ourselves back in a place where we're coming from? Let's look at the debt trap of the 1970s and 1980s very briefly. Jamaica's public debt surpassed $1 billion by 1976. As the government pursued large-scale infrastructure projects, social spending, and an expanding public sector, contrary to IMF-mandated fiscal reforms. Those of you who follow me on Twitter, you would see the concern I raised about the minister's statement with regards to the wage to GDP percentage. The first IMF loan of US $74.6 million in 1977 was meant to stabilize the economy. But the administration failed to implement necessary structural adjustments, leading to growing fiscal imbalances. By the early 1980s, we had the oil price shock, the OPEC windfall gains. This drove up global interest rates, quadrupling Jamaica's external debt servicing cost. Exchange rate shortages and persistent trade deficits triggered a full-scale balance of payment crisis. Exchange controls were implemented to manage the crisis, but this stifled economic growth and further eroded investor confidence, and Stone spoke about this in 1985. The Siaga administration of 1980 to 1989 pursued debt restructuring and liberalization policies, but public debt ballooned from $5.663 billion in 1980 to $35.389 billion by 1989. What does this mean for 2025? If Jamaica fails to control its trade deficit and remains overly dependent on imports, a balance of payment crisis in 2025 could trigger currency devaluation, increasing the cost of imported goods, leading to inflation. This could drive up debt servicing costs, eroding fiscal stability. This could force renewed reliance on IMF support, with potential austerity measures again. A return to excessive borrowing would threaten decades of progress in reducing debt to GDP levels. Let's talk about the persistent trade balance. Jamaica's chronic trade deficit stems from high import dependence and low export competitiveness. The Caribbean Basin Initiative facilitated U.S. market access while restricting regional industrial growth, reinforcing Jamaica's dependence on imported goods and foreign capital. Between 1990 and 2010, Imports consistently outpaced exports by 30 to 73%, leading to low foreign exchange inflows, driving up demands for US dollars. It led to currency depreciation, increasing debt servicing costs. And a significant portion of our debt was external debt in foreign currency. It led to economic stagnation as domestic production failed to meet consumption needs. Even the United Nations recognized this in 2011. And we still have a challenge because productivity levels are low. Not only are productivity levels low, but we are not really properly diversified as an economy. A new balance of payment crisis in 2025, exacerbated by rising US tariffs, global oil price shocks, or supply chain disruptions, could widen the current account deficit and pressure the net international reserves. Then we have the risk of reserve depletion and IMF dependency again. Jamaica's NIR serve as a buffer against external shocks. NIR is net international reserves. But history shows how quickly reserves can be depleted. Let's look at the history. Let's start with the 1973 oil crisis. A sharp rise in oil prices led Jamaica to seek IMF and World Bank assistance for debt financing. This continued with the 1980s debt spiral. IMF imposed austerity measures and continued borrowing deepened Jamaica's debt crisis. Then we had the COVID-19 shock in 2020, where the IMF provided a $520 million disbursement to meet urgent balance of payment needs. This was according to the IMF 2020. If a balance of payment crisis emerges in 2025, Jamaica may be forced to borrow aggressively from capital markets at higher interest rates. It means the debt servicing cost is going to have an impact on the budget. We may also be forced to seek another IMF bailout, leading to austerity measures. Either of the two scenarios would significantly weaken fiscal stability and reverse recent economic progress. We pray this does not happen. Let's look at the possible borrowing spiral and the threat to credit ratings. Jamaica's credit rating improvements has been seen. S&P, Moody's, Fitch. They have lowered borrowing costs because we have improved our credit ratings. When your credit ratings are good, then you can borrow at lower rates. However, a balance of payment crisis in 2025 could trigger higher borrowing costs on global markets as investors demand risk premium, meaning that if you are going to be offering me a security, I want to be compensated for the risk that I'm taking. Then we could also see credit rating downgrades, reducing Jamaica's access to affordable financing. We could also see a return to debt dependency, erasing years of fiscal discipline. The Siaga administration in 1987, debt for equity swap, attempted to reduce debt burdens, but borrowing continued, exacerbating Jamaica's vulnerability to external shocks. A similar pattern could emerge now in 2025 if Jamaica fails to address structural weaknesses in trade and production. I believe it's time for us to call for policy vigilance. Jamaica's past debt crises were driven by chronic trade deficits, heavy reliance on imports, currency devaluation cycles, excessive external borrowing. To avoid repeating history, policymakers must take decisive action to expand export-led growth, to reduce trade deficits, build foreign exchange reserves to buffer against shocks, maintain fiscal discipline and debt sustainability, invest in energy security to mitigate oil price risks, and avoid excessive reliance on external borrowing. Jamaica is standing at a crossroad. Without urgent economic diversification that I've been calling for ad infinitum, and fiscal prudence, a balance of payment crisis in 2025 could unravel decades of progress, forcing the country back into an IMF-dependent debt spiral. I don't believe we want to go there. The time to act is now. We need to look at productivity. We need to look at economic diversification. I made about 10 recommendations as to the areas we could look at for diversifying the economy. I'm not going to repeat them here. For those persons who want to understand the history, read my book, The Governance Public Debt Nexus, a case study of Jamaica with Barbados and Singapore's comparators. It's available on Amazon and it's not expensive. Have a fantastic week. Bye.